This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome, listeners, to this episode of Thrive Perspectives as we kind of conclude our series, What's Your Story? The influence of the Christian story on Western culture is profound and pervasive, even among those who reject its religious aspects. This is because the Christian story has shaped the moral and ethical framework of Western society for centuries. Concepts such as human dignity, justice, compassion, and the sanctity of life are all derived from biblical teaching. Even the very democracy we guard so tightly is a result of the teachings and actions of the Church. Even if individuals do not consciously acknowledge the biblical origins of these values, they've been ingrained in the cultural and societal norms that influence their beliefs and behaviours. Let's join Matt and Connell as we discuss Christian history in the context of the overall narrative of the Christian story. So Matt and Connell, church history. Continue our dialogue on story, and we're going to jump into this church history. And what we know about church history, what the world would want us to know about church history, perhaps, or what secular history records as church history. And I think many of us could probably pick out some of the things that constantly get thrown at us, about church and religion. But there's much more, and I guess that's what we want to work our way through today. Yeah.
So we want to apply the same sort of way of thinking. So let's go back to our original picture of the page full of dots. Essentially, in any given period, any given chunk of period, you could represent as a page full of dots, each dot representing an action, right? Because history is the record of human actions and interactions, right, that shape the world in which we live. So there are many, many different, at any given period, so many things happening. What counts as history? What dots do you... Historians have to choose what they think is the most significant thing. Often history is a lot about what's available to us. Okay? Yes. So if you're going back to the ancient period, for example, so in BC, before Christ, particularly once you go further than 1000 BC, further back, I mean, you're working with archaeological records, you're working with fairly scant documentation and so forth. And so you've just got to work with what you've got. And naturally that documentation will represent just a surface level, really, and then you construct something from that. You still have to choose and interpret. Yes. There's a lot for the historian to do. Yeah, and so what we've talked about in the previous episodes, and hopefully people have started to get an understanding of, is that the historians, in a sense, choose those dots based on the agenda of the story they're wanting to tell. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so in some way, perhaps some of the things that we treat as being the big things in history are that because they were the dots that were chosen, not necessarily because they were the most important things for everyone in history. But that's how storytelling works. And I think it'd be important to say the Bible and church history isn't different to any other history recording. Every person who's recorded history has to choose, because as you've said in our previous episodes, there's so many dots you couldn't record everything. So they're picking it out, and of course everyone picks it out with what they want to highlight. That's right.
You've got to be careful there too. It's not like it's historians as one group picks one version and Christians pick a different. That would be problematic. So I don't want to I know it's not what you're saying, but just to clarify that, because I think the point is, depends on the historian as to the story they want to tell. It's not that history has different markers to what we do in the church, but we use history. There are lots of markers, and then depending on what the narrative is that particular historian wants to tell, then you would pick from the dots. The dots are still there. They're not up for debate. We know certain things happen at certain times, and then we assemble them together to tell a particular story through history. And perhaps just for clarity as well, I used the word agenda, which sounds a little bit
Like almost too strongly motivated.
Yes. Whereas it's more probably just what they feel is the most important thing to them.
That's right.
And we all have, like, if I came to a church and I'd never been to a church before, I might think, oh, gee, the music was the best thing. But someone else would come and go, oh, it was much more about the connection thing. So I go and write a review on this church, and it's all about how great the music is, because that's the angle I come from. I'm a musician, and the music may well be good. But someone else comes, and for them it's much more about feeling like they were cared for, and people, welcomed them, and they don't really care that much about the music. And they write their review on, Google Maps about that. They're both true. It's just that they've picked out different dots.
And the dots are fact. If I wanted to paint a picture that the church was responsible for all the violence in the world, all the way through from the time of Christ, for example, I could go through and pick out all the historical events that showed Christians behaving badly and how Christianity was.
But that is a disingenuous agenda, which is what I'm saying. Most historians aren't writing from that point of view.
It's not even disingenuous. That's just the point that they might be trying to make.
Yes.
Where others who would be wanting to paint a good picture of Christianity could pick out a whole different set of dots. So if you only looked at the dots where Christians were behaving badly, over 2,000 years, these are all the terrible things Christians have done. You'd walk away with the idea that Christians are terrible people, and the movement and ideas behind Christianity are
which does happen,
evil.
And that does happen, and I think, and this is why it's a good topic to talk about.
But those are the two extremes. I think it's important to say we're not trying
extremes.
to. I think there's a whole lot of conversation we can have about the mainstream rather than the two extremes, where there are people who do take that agenda and there are others who take the other agenda. But let's
and can I say too, like, historians are, I think, being quite self-critical in this as well. So they do recognise certain agendas. So, and I would say probably the last 2 or 3 decades particularly, it's been really interesting to see a new wave of history being written, and this is from secular historians going back into Christian history, and recognising actually since about the 1700s, this period that we refer to in inverted commas as the Enlightenment, people like Gibbon and Voltaire and people like this who started looking back at history, and they cast history, particularly church history, in a very negative light. They referred to what they were doing as the Enlightenment, which meant that they kind of invent this idea of a dark ages. I mean, we still have that sort of idea lurking around today, but that's quite a myth, really, that this idea that there was the glory of the Roman Empire, and then Christianity, sort of pervades that. Roman Empire falls, and you've just got the reign of superstition, and of Christian superstition and sort of papal tyranny, suppressing everyone's freedom to, freedom of thought. Then the Renaissance comes, right, in the 1300s, and you've got this rebirth of, Greco-Roman thought, and that sort of eventually leads to, but then ultimately it's the Enlightenment, starting with the philosophers, in the 1600s and the 1700s, and culminating in the 1700s when the people who are saying this, right, that's generally accepted now as a myth, right? It's essentially an anti-Christian myth. And the people that are recognizing that as a myth, they're not just Christian historians. There's the recognition that there was an agenda there, actually, and that way of casting history is completely false. So it's interesting how you can take what seem to be the facts, and you can be so selective, and you can impose on that a structure to say, to say what you want to say, really. And I think, as I said, there's been, I think, a much more constructive approach to history in the last few decades that has recognized that there's a lot of, and really, I mean, history as a subject really emerged from the Enlightenment, that kind of interest in the facts and the history, particularly in the 1800s with the advent of archaeology and so forth, a lot more interest in history as a subject. And so, but it sort of fed on this kind of Enlightenment sort of picture, which was very sort of anti-Christian. I mean, the other thing that they did was to kind of overemphasize certain things, certain atrocities, or certain, like the famous one is the Spanish Inquisition. It's just like people just think torture chambers, these terrible, terrible things. And Rodney Stark, in his book, The Triumph of Christianity, again, written from a secular point of view,
So Rodney Stark is a secular
historian and sociologist, actually. And actually, the triumph of Christianity is one of these approaches to Christian history that does acknowledge that there's been a lot of anti-history being done, and I mean, he talks about the Inquisition, and he said, look, absolutely, there was some bad stuff that was done there, but it was just blown up so much. So we get this caricature, that's still with us today. And again, it's not that we need to deny that bad things were done in the name of Christ, because Jesus actually warned us beforehand, right? Yeah. This is probably the first important lens to thinking about Christian history. Jesus, first of all, he says that the kingdom of God is going to be like yeast that spreads through the dough, right? So it's going to spread through the world. But one of the things that he was saying and getting across to his disciples is that the kingdom of God isn't going to be this imposing political military movement, because, of course, the Jews in the first century, they thought that's how the Messiah was going to bring all the nations under his lordship. Okay, there will be a day when Jesus will return, and there will be that final defeat of all evil and so forth. Okay, but in this age, Jesus made it very clear that it's not going to work like that. Right? Yeah. So it's not going to be at the point of the sword. It's not going to be this imposing political movement, but it will be like yeast spreading through the dough. Now, the problem with that from the historical point of view is that when a historian looks at history, again, remember what I said before, we can only access what's available to us. And the most available stuff is the battles and the decrees of kings.
The big stuff,
all
not the power.
Quiet. Yeah. I mean, so the yeast spreading through the dough is largely unseen. This is the first problem with the concept of Christian history and with what truly counts as Christian history. And so straight away, you're working with a strata, like an upper strata of history. You're relying on the people who were actually literate and could record things. Yeah. You're relying on things that were preserved, okay? So you're essentially relying on where the power was. Yeah. That's what's most visible, and wherever the power is.
Yeah, and where the power was, their interpretation was what carried.
That's right.
And it was very unverifiable.
That's right. And the problem with that is that Jesus, again, tells us that the kingdom of God is going to be working mainly through powerlessness, right? It's through the ordinary people in often very powerless situations. Now that is recorded, of course, the martyrdoms and all of this sort of stuff. That is a matter of record. So it's not that there's no record. We know enough to know that there are these amazing grassroots movement, despite what kings and popes and people in power are doing. The kingdom of God was always spreading. But Jesus also told us that there was going to be wolves in sheep's clothing. There were going to be false prophets and false messiahs. And so he led us to expect that there would be people coming up from within the church that would be even in high positions of leadership who would be false prophets or false messiahs. And so we should expect that, right? In a sense, he's telling us beforehand that this stuff's going to exist. So that's the first thing we need to remember, that we shouldn't be perturbed by the fact that bad people came and they did really terrible things in the name of Jesus. I mean, if I was the devil and, dare I say it, if I was the devil and wanted to destroy the church, I mean, the best way to do that is to get in amongst it and do really bad things in the name of Christ. And put everyone off. Yeah.
Maybe the problem here is that instead of trying to understand Christianity by observing history and what people did, maybe the problem is we've actually got to go back and understand Christianity and then observe history from that perspective, instead of just observing facts of who killed who and who invaded who and who did what, and then saying, well, I'm going to take those facts and then decide what Christianity is and interpret everything through that lens of looking back. Maybe it makes more sense to actually understand what Christianity is and look at history looking forward. So we actually observe that thread, the core values, the core ideas of Christianity through history. So in amongst all of the bad stuff that happened, how did those values and core ideas, how did they prevail?
Yeah.
So then that's where I guess you kind of start to look at it and go, well, as you said, the big idea of Christianity is this sort of upside down kingdom where the least powerful become the most powerful. And it started right at the cross, with the highest became the lowest. It was almost like it starts here, dropping the pin in the map. This is what the yeast spreading through the dough is going to look like. This is how it's going to be done. We're literally flipping everything upside down. So now when you're looking at history, okay, there's all these bad things done, but then what was a result of that? And how did the church and the context around it respond to it? And how did Christians respond to those things? And so you ask bigger questions than just going, well, there's this fact, this fact, this fact. You start to try to understand that footprint. It's almost like the footprint of Christianity through history is more important rather than just observing the hard facts. So I feel like you've got to look forward.
Yeah, so that you do see the effects of, in a sense, on the dough. Like, I mean, a classic example is someone like St. Francis of Assisi, right? Let's take a lowly figure. So here's a guy that's great in the eyes of the world, is a rich merchant's son. This is just one example. And he decides to give everything up and he lives in poverty amongst the poor, right? Now, St. Francis has an enormous effect on subsequent history. I mean, he's a nobody, right? But his effect, and he starts a spiritual movement that even changes the way that people think about Jesus. It's from this, and you see this in the art. I mean, it's lots of windows on church history. Church art is a very interesting window on church history. It's why it's important to just get away from battles and decrees. Because battles and decrees naturally and what you say is true, Connell, because we can bring a secular mindset of what in a secular mind is important is that top-down kind of history, right? But actually, like you said, it's an upside-down kingdom. So it's actually going to be bottom-up. And you see that in St. Francis. It's this bottom-up kind of process. Like, here is this guy that responds to this sense of call. He gives up everything. He preaches amongst the poor. And he has this incredible effect, changing the way that people think. You see it reflected in the art. Suddenly, there's greater emphasis on this suffering Messiah. You get paintings of Jesus, really the first paintings of Jesus visibly suffering, and this sense of the Jesus who relates to the poor and the everyday person. I mean, it's there before, but you get this groundswell movement, and then it has this effect on the spirituality of the church, and enormous, really. So church history is, you see this happening again and again and again. And it's not that the stuff that's happening at the higher levels is irrelevant. That is also relevant. There are really interesting things happening there, because we see this reflected in, for example, in Tom Holland in his book Dominion, and I've mentioned, I think in a previous episode, Larry Siedentop's book Inventing the Individual, which is the origins of Western liberalism. And it's a brilliant book where he goes back through history. He's an Oxford historian. And he says, where did we, our system of values that respects the integrity of the individual, the sanctity, sacredness of individual life, and this idea of human rights and equality, because it was never there in the ancient world, and it's not evident from nature either, because it's very evident that people aren't equal. If you just look at our attributes and strengths and outcomes and so forth, it's very evident that people aren't equal. And no one in the ancient world thought they were. So he's asking the question, where did this idea come from, right? And he essentially, you could go right back to, obviously you go back to the Bible as the source, but he goes back to Paul, the Apostle Paul. Again, this is a secular historian. And he says he injected this idea into the world, right? This is a guy who, by the way, gives up the prospects of being a leading rabbi, steps down from that, is constantly in jail, is like...
Well, even before that, I mean, he's chasing the Christians down.
Yeah.
Let's start there. Paul.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah. But I'm trying to paint a picture. This is not someone that in worldly terms has a lot of importance, right?
Yeah.
But he cedes, it's a little bit like St. Francis. He really does give up. He really does give up everything. I mean, Paul obviously is the one that really applies the life and teaching of Jesus, and he's the one that, under the inspiration of God, really helps lay this foundation. As Siedentop says, these incredibly powerful and completely countercultural ideas, right? And what happens is, and he traces the power of these ideas as they are taken on by people, right? You've got churches with master and slave and men and women all sitting at the same table and sharing communion, and this sense, this imperative that every person, every soul, you're not just a cog in a social machine. You're not defined by where you are in the hierarchy. You're not valued by where you are in the hierarchy. So, for example, even Aristotle, who's the kind of the hero of ancient Greek ethics, writes one of the most famous books on ethics in the ancient world. This is a guy that refers to slaves as being human tools.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. He does not think they're fully human, right? This is a guy this is the great ethicist of the ancient world, right? Whereas Paul writes this letter, the letter to Philemon, little letter recorded in the New Testament.
Which most of us miss.
Absolutely revolutionary. Now, we read over it because he says to a slave owner, he says, you need to treat your slave like your brother. And we because we're so used to these.
Yeah, that's right. Totally.
We breathe this. We're so used to. We think, the brotherhood of man, but this is not a thing back then, right? Yeah, it's difficult for us to imagine a world where that was not a thing. Where when Paul says, not only should you treat him as human, but is saying to essentially an aristocrat, you have to treat with when family was treat him
and
like
hierarchies
a brother.
within the family. Yeah, totally.
He's your brother.
Yeah.
That is so revolutionary. And what you see actually is that this happens. And certainly within the church, this gets practiced. And by the time, even in the early Middle Ages, you start to get this dissipation of slavery as an institution from the inside out.
Yeah.
Because there's this fundamental belief in the equality of all souls. That by the time the empire becomes Christian in inverted commas, and this is where a lot of the criticisms come, because it became very powerful and, there were incentives to be Christian. This is going way into probably 500-600 AD.
Well, yeah.
But still, these ideas were still at work, right?
Yeah.
So,
but even like looking at slavery, we look at it through our eyes today. Looking back, we look at that as a negative, treating a slave as a brother. We look at it and go, well, it should be saying you shouldn't have him as a slave at all. But in the time, it was revolutionary.
But the only thing that's changed that is the Christian faith.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a completely different way of looking at people. Yeah.
But it was that slow taking the long route for change. So rather than just saying a law that says you must not have a slave, because then it just becomes like every other law.
Legislative morality.
It becomes something that gets questioned and opposed. And the way that it seems to work from the Christian perspective is that it's putting ideas into society that have a transformative effect over time. Like it changes people's mind so that where we are now from
that's right. So it's not just ideas. It's actually a new disposition. Well, it's a new heart.
So now it's taken us so far down that line that we look back at it and where it says you should treat a slave as a brother and so on, we look at that and go, that's terrible.
A given. Yeah.
Well, no, we said that, no, not even a given. Like you shouldn't even have slaves. It's appalling. Totally. Imagine us saying that nowadays. Oh, it's okay to have slaves, but
treat them like a brother.
But just if you have a slave, treat them like a brother. That would be abhorrent for even us to come out and say that. But that's the transformative effect. It's actually changed our mind.
Yeah, we think that way because
that's
right.
So it was never about the law that says you should not have a slave. Changes your mind to value human life fundamentally, so you wouldn't even want to have a slave.
And this is the challenge, I think, in Western society, where we've become so accustomed to these values, which are essentially biblical values, that we don't recognize how revolutionary Christianity is.
Yes, and when we make these judgments and we look back at figures in Christian history and we make moral judgments, those moral judgments against the church at those times are based on Christian assumptions, right? And it's because of the influence of Christian history that we can even make those assumptions. So those questions were pondered by church leaders in the Middle Ages, this institution of slavery. So it was definitely seen as problematic. But the thing is, like, they were asking this question, well, what do we actually do? Like, where do they all go? Because then you just create like an impoverished caste, essentially.
Yeah.
So they realized it just wasn't as simple as that. So, a much better way is to retain the integrity of the households, but to change the culture of the households so that these people, that they're still, it's to change the relationships. So, did they get that right? Well, look, the fact is that they were grappling with these problems. They couldn't find a way, because it was so embedded and so entrenched. They couldn't find a way of just automatically changed it. So they just kept emphasizing the attitudal shift.
And when you say they, I just want to make a point here, because I don't want us to start thinking that there was some rule that was sent out.
Yeah.
They decreed that this must be what we must do because we can't find a way to house all these slaves and feed them.
Yeah.
No, it was just changing the heart. And people go, well, the best way for me to treat him like a brother is to actually have him as a brother in my family. It didn't have to be legislated, is what I'm saying.
Well, yeah. And also let's not misunderstand the nature of church hierarchy, because one of the interesting things is that bishops were elected. In fact, the idea of electing a leader is completely a Christian idea, because as soon as you recognize the integrity and the importance of every single soul, then it puts a lot of importance back on the individual people. So this idea that, the bishop needs to be recognized by the people, because it's not an inherent, or it's not
hierarchy based on
family lineage or whatever, right? So
or status,
because that's the way it worked, right? If in everywhere else in society, it was inherent. You are inherently better, and that's why you have the. So if you get rid of that you're not inherently better, well, how do you choose who the leaders are, right? See, it's difficult for us to imagine this. So in the church, they recognized that. Okay, and so they said, well, the people actually recognize the bishop. And so it's this bottom-up sort of process. So again, and Seedentop makes this point, that's the origin of the notion of democracy, right? Democracy depends on the fact that each person's decision matters. In the ancient world, that was unintelligible. Unintelligible, because there was a fixed hierarchy. The people down the bottom weren't even fully human, right? It didn't matter what they thought. But when you put infinite importance and sacred value on every individual soul, that is enormously revolutionary. And so you get this new. Now, was that always practiced? And yes, there were periods in the history of the church. And again, this can be overstated, but yes, there were periods where bishoprics were bought and sold. There were periods when they were handed out to your mates, because they became very powerful positions. But here's the thing. There were abuses, but the abuses were always called out from within. All through church history, you could think of the worst, and there were times when, the papacy was no better than a secular ruler, right? But even at those very worst times, there were powerful, powerful reforming movements at work in the church, right? So the seeds were there. And of course, when you look back through church history, you see these ruptures again and again and again that lead to renewal and reformation. Are not just the Reformation that we know, but this actually there were successive reforms throughout the church, because the seeds of that are within the church. Now, this is actually the origins. I mean, this is the irony. The notion of revolution doesn't exist. The idea of a revolution didn't exist without this idea that the people are important. And there's a recognition that we've strayed from some higher ideal. So straight away, you're putting an ideal above individuals who have inherent power, right? So whatever you think of, let's go to the worst moments of the church, there was still this ideal that was there. Constituted their existence that they could be critiqued against.
Isn't this the point, though? You see the ideal play out, things are good, and then the natural tendency is for us to try to take control or to take power, and then it doesn't end well. Isn't history then something that we learn from? From a Christian perspective, it's a demonstration over and over and over again that even for those who are Christians and have bought into the idea of Christianity, then we go, well, how can I make this about me or about my power or how can I impose Christianity on more people? Like we've seen, it didn't work out well for Constantine. Tried to do it. And
he didn't try to do it.
He didn't?
No, he didn't.
But it was kind of
legislative.
But it was kind of like became the religion of the land, and
it did late. So Constantine becomes a Christian in 312 and 313, and he legalizes Christianity. Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire only in the 380s.
Yep.
So it's only much later that it becomes that. There were emperors who, there were incentives because it becomes quite a powerful force.
Yeah.
But this is even throughout the 4th century. Okay, great, persecution's over. I mean, you don't want a situation where there's persecution. So the persecution's over. So they were finally able to all get together in church councils and consolidate some things because persecution was constantly scattering them, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a wonderful, the 4th century was actually a wonderful time of peace to enable the church to get together and establish some things that they already believed, but that kind of solidify those, and that's the famous councils and so forth.
But I think your point, which I was going to make, and you kind of made it for me, and referring to the Roman Empire, and we stand corrected, Constantine didn't try to do it. But I think your point that you're trying to make is when we try to, in a sense, make it bigger than just my influence from the inside out, where we try to kind of influence it from the outside in, it doesn't go well.
Yeah.
And I mean, we can see that right back to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and Peter.
Yeah, with the sword, So there were. I mean, you're right in that there were periods where there was that kind of pressure. It was never fully adopted, like in the same way. Contrast with Islam, which was very much at the point of the sword.
Yes.
Because Islam is just about obedience. Whereas the very core of Christianity is about heart change. An individual needs to genuinely choose. Now, there were periods where where perhaps there was force, but it was always recognized straight away, and there were always voices saying that's a contradiction in terms. So, for example, Larry Siedentop says, secularism, he says, the secular is Christianity's gift to the world. And what he means by that is that there was never any secular space, a non-religious space in the ancient world. So take ancient Rome and the ancient Roman gods. You were not free to not worship the Roman gods, right? Because if everyone didn't worship their Roman gods, then that could have important implications. Like we're not going to get the favor of the gods and the Roman Empire is going to fall, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when the Roman Empire did fall, they blamed it on the Christians because, some people were saying the Christians, caused people to turn away from the Roman gods. If you're a member of a family, you have you have a family shrine and you have family gods. You're not free, right?
No, that's right.
You're not free to not worship those gods. There was no secular space. You see this in when Islam comes in. There was no freedom to not follow Muhammad or whatever. So by contrast, however, the Christian idea, and this was unique. This is a unique idea that because there's an integrity of the individual soul, right? And God is looking for a relational decision from each individual person. In order to genuinely believe, there needs to be a space for people to genuinely not believe.
Yeah.
That's the secular space. So it's not saying the secular space is good. It's absolutely necessary for genuine belief to exist. There has to exist a secular space in which it's possible not to believe.
It's the two trees. If there's only one tree,
you have to have the two trees.
But it also creates a difference, which has always been important. Maybe this is where as my example before was going to go with like Constantine in Rome, is that as Christianity becomes more of the normal mode of life and belief in the society, that difference becomes less and less because everybody who lives here are Christians. So I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that God always wants to do is to bring that polarization that needs to happen. There needs to be a difference. You can be here or you can be here. It's your choice.
Yeah.
And if you don't create a space for that difference to be allowed to flourish and be free, that is a big idea of Christianity. The idea that it has to be a personal, it's not just ascribing to a set of beliefs. It's a personal,
or following a set of rules.
It's got to be a personal response in your own belief, not in facts, but belief in the person.
Yeah, but there have been examples, and again, this is where we can learn from history, because there have been examples where that secular space has been abolished. Now, this is important because I think even Christians today, they think, we need to get rid of that. Right?
Let's have a Christian country.
Let's have a Christian country. Okay, so you can look at history. Mm-hmm. Now, did that work? Because that has happened in history. Yeah. I mean, the example that I've used before, because it's familiar, to me from the academic work that I've done. But Denmark in the 19th century, so early 1800s, in order to be a citizen of Denmark, you had to be baptized to be a citizen. So it was like 100% Christian, right? Yeah. In inverted commas, Christian. And Søren Kierkegaard, is a bit of a kind of a dissenting voice. He complains this is very hard to become a Christian when you already are one. Yeah. Yeah. So he refers to Denmark as baptized paganism. Mm. Now, these countries today are actually amongst some of the least Christian countries in the world, because wherever it's been enforced, wherever you lose that choice, or wherever Christianity is most powerful, you get the most resentment. I mean, I think we've got to be very cautious about celebrating legislative successes. Cautious, I say, not because there are some occasions in history where Christian influence has led to wonderful things, the abolition of slavery in the early 1800s. Now, we're going to be careful, though, not to apply that to saying, well, we need to therefore force everyone to be Christians, as though that's a kind of Wilberforce imperative. Yeah. Yeah. And at times I think we take that imperative, because remember, the slaves didn't want to be slaves. They wanted to be free, right? Yeah. So, and it was the Christian influence that led to that. And, but even then there was still needed to be a gradual change of mind, because there were plenty of slave owners that didn't want that, and that was kind of forced on them. But over time, the mentality took hold and it, had this important social effect. So that's good. Like you see these social effects. But remember, the early 1800s is the aftermath to this famous period in church history called the Great Awakening, right? Mm. So it wasn't just a bunch of Christians wielding power and imposing something on a society. No, there'd been an amazing revival in society. In that society, a move of God that led to a real change of heart in a lot of people, that led to this groundswell movement that magnified the conscience of a nation to the point where slavery became abhorrent. And so you get this inside out kind of movement. And you see that, now look, 1800s, then you go into Victorianism and there were all sorts of bad things as well because then it became this system, this kind of moralistic, almost nominal, similar to Denmark, in fact. The Great Awakening leads to this kind of widespread sort of moralistic veneer of Christianity over the top of society in the Victorian period. Yeah. And that becomes problematic, right? Yeah, again. So...
But isn't that what we learn through history? Isn't history there? Isn't the point of history is not just to recount the facts, but we've got to learn, the best way to learn how to respond in the future is to understand history. Yeah. So... the point of history is to paint a picture of what happens when we keep getting it wrong. So Christian history shows what happens when we keep getting it wrong, and not just from a non-Christian perspective, but what happens as Christians we get it wrong because we think that we celebrate more control at a government level because now we can instill Christian values in society
and force them.
Go back and look at history. It's never worked. Yeah. It's always worked out worse. So we've got to look back at
if we focus on trying to advance the kingdom with the wrong tools.
Yeah.
Now, certainly the political space is a space that Christians need to be present in, and we need to be wielding influence.
But as yeast,
change,
not as swords.
Exactly.
To change mind, change minds.
But also, I mean, it's a really interesting principle, and let's. Again, this is fresh in my mind because I've just finished reading Siedentop's Inventing the Individual, which is a book that I do recommend, actually. So
I'll put that in the notes.
It is a fairly dense read, but it's absolutely fascinating for anyone who's a
that's okay. I'm a fairly dense reader, so it should be fine.
So anyway, but he makes a really interesting point that what the church did at particular points becomes this model for society. So I've already mentioned about the election of bishops, right? So the church is doing this, electing leaders, right? This is something new in the ancient world. One of the other things as you move into the period, and this was interesting to me because we tend to think of the high Middle Ages, say around 1300s, for example, as a period of great corruption in the church, because the church was very, very powerful, right? But he talks about something that was happening that is going to even in the midst of that's happening, that was going to have a big effect on society. Because one of the things that the church was doing during that period and leading up to that period was the establishment of this big internal bureaucratic system of church courts and canon law, right? So they created this very, very complex system.
Give us a date. Where are we here now?
Let's say, this is over a long period of time. Yeah. So let's put a pin in around 1300s.
1300s, okay.
Let's put a pin in the 1300s. Going to the 1400s and even leading up to that. So you've got to think feudal society at this point. Society is broken up into lots of little princedoms, essentially, and they're all fighting with each other, right? So it's kind of chaos. The church is the only thing that's spread. It's the one big institution that transcends all of those princedoms, and, it's this one coherent thing in the midst of all the chaos. So what the church does through this period is putting together this canon law based on biblical principles of the importance of the individual, principles of justice, and they establish church law courts. And the Pope then, rules in accordance with this. And so what you get these church lawyers. Now, this is partly what went wrong, okay? Because you've got this very complex system of church lawyers. There's probably more study of law because they did use the Roman systems of law and they studied that, but they applied Christian principles to it, right? And it's really interesting. And as I said, part of the problem was that there's more lawyer stuff going on. And some of the most corrupt popes were, because there are kind of two streams of papacy, those who are more kind of academic lawyers that came to power and those who came out of the monasteries, right? The guys that came out of the monasteries were the reformers. The guys who were the lawyers, the really smart guys that were putting together canon law, there were times when they became popes as well.
Right.
Okay, they were they tended to be more power-oriented and there was plenty of corruption there. But there was something really positive happening through that because what they created was an international system, law system, based on principles. Because the only law in the past, justice, was essentially the will of the strongest person. That was whatever the king said goes. Whatever the emperor says, that's law. That was kind of how it worked before. But what Christianity recognizes is that there's a system, there's a right and a wrong that sits beyond that. And there's absolute justice. And it's all based on Christian principles like love and mercy and justice and all of these sorts of things, right? And so they created this, this system of law. Now that is what leads to the creation of what we now know as nation states, constitutional monarchies, which starts with constitutional monarchies, right? This idea of systems of courts based on a coherent, unified system of law. Kings, monarchs started to model the laws of their countries on church law. Canon law in the church became the model for a coherent system of law, which led to the creation of what we now know as nation states. So the world that we now live in was the result of something that was happening in the church. This desire to model a society based on principles that are bigger than just the will of the strongest individual.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. That was remarkable influence. Because again, why do these ideas take hold? It's because they're true. They take hold because they're true, right? I mean, the ideas of slaves as human tools. I guarantee that those slaves, they didn't feel like human tools. They looked at their kids. They knew that these children, when they loved their children, they knew that my child is not just a human tool, right? It didn't take hold, right? Because it wasn't true.
Yeah.
But what Christianity does, it comes in with these principles and it sows this truth into it. And people might fight against it and reject it, which they did, and persecute it. But after a while,
it's almost
if it's embodied, it takes root.
It's like they've got to do that. You've got to have that interplay between two ideas that have got to play it out and fight it out, and you're going to see all the good and bad that comes out from it. But gradually, over time, those ideas start to take hold, and then real change happens. So it's not just legislated by someone that says, okay, this is the new set of standards and laws that we're going to adhere to as a society. It just comes a point in history where it's sort of spread through the dough enough that society actually wants it and people actually, and now it can actually stick and be a truly transformative thing. Even like Tom Holland's book, Dominion, he describes the crucifixion was detonating basically a bomb that was going to really, I'm paraphrasing it, this is the idea, it was essentially going to sort of, the ripple of that was going to just expand all down through the ages to come to transform around those kind of key central ideas of Christianity. And that's what I think that's what I mean by going back to that point and then looking out, because otherwise you just look back and see all the interplay and the fighting and the corruption, which kind of needed to happen to make those ideas become infused, and then society becomes ready to adopt those values. Now, looking at, say, for example, or the transformation in the law, like you were just talking about, in the way the courts worked, and that was a thing that was, the monarchs recognized all of those values, and the people, that's what people want, and it had a transformative effect on society as a whole. But I think from my vantage point, or from our vantage point of modern history, a lot of people would look at that and go, that's actually a breakaway from church. That was secular society kind of.
Well, that's
freeing.
The way it's read.
It's read. Yeah.
It's
but
read
they
that
misunderstand
way.
where they even got it from in the first place. So even so, this is the irony of this kind of like the Enlightenment. Oh, let's just focus on the brotherhood, let's just focus on the, all this, like Rousseau, classic, well, he's slightly post-Enlightenment, but very much a sort of secularizing sort of figure. Oh, all people are equal. It's the brotherhood of man. I mean, Voltaire and all these guys. I mean, they were all these Enlightenment thinkers. They were throwing around these ideas of morality and equality and French Revolution, like the idea, these revolutionary ideas of the equality of people and fraternity and brotherhood and justice and the irony of but we reject the church. It's like, where did you even get those ideas from?
Yeah.
And this is what these historians are now pointing out, and it's that these are all ideas that were seeded through the church. And yes, absolutely, at that time in France in the 1700s, the church wasn't in a good way, and it was just entitled. It was linked up with the aristocracy, and it was very entitled, and it wasn't doing its job really. And but the fact is that, and also partly because they'd killed all the Huguenots, who were actually a kind of reforming movement. So, yes, there were problems there, but the solutions were all birthed out of Christian. I mean, and of course, then trying to. I mean, the classic thing, of course, in the French Revolution is to take Christian ideas, but now we're going to impose them which leads to what was known as the horrors, this endless sort of killing spree. Yeah. So that becomes problematic. And Tom Holland points out, even today, the two sides of politics, left and right, the undergirding values of the two sides of politics, the values are Christian values.
Yeah.
I mean, totally Christian values.
Totally.
So he refers to left and right as essentially a kind of debate within a Christian influence society. Now, I know we're a society, and particularly in our country in Australia, we're shedding that and we're throwing, but people can get distracted because we're throwing out bits. Okay, we used to think that was wrong. Now we're celebrating is right. We're throwing out bits, but the undergirding values are still Christian ideas, which still have a hold. This is the point that people like Holland and Siedentop and these guys are making, that these ideas have taken hold, even if we reject them in practice.
So if you start with the values, you read history a certain way. If you start with the values that we've now moved to in terms of our modern society, as we're looking back through history, a lot of people, and this would be a fairly mainstream view, would view democracy, elections, separation of church and state as being a result of doing away with Christianity, as if those systems, so prior to that, there was religious systems or heavily religious governments that ruled over the people, which we've just mentioned before. And then we have a democracy and a separation of church and state. So we finally got religion out of government, and now we've got democracy.
Whereas the very concept of church and state is a Christian idea.
Which is really interesting. So it depends which way do you want to look at history. Do we want to look back, or do we start back at the values and then look forward? And I think it doesn't matter what way you want to look at it, but I think that makes much more sense, is to start with the values and understand the context of where we came from. And read that forward in order to make sense of history. We can't start from where we are today and then interpret history through those eyes.
And disregard how we got to where we are today.
And I think most historians, whatever perspective you have, would agree with that. We need to understand the context. Like, we have a fact in history. What led to that fact? Well, there was all sorts of other things going on in society at that time that led to that factual event occurring. So in order to understand that factual event, you've then got to go and then research all the context and the other things and the ideas of the day. And when you listen to really good historians teaching on these different things, that's what they always bring out. It was never about the fact was just the culmination of a whole lot of other things all coming together. And so to understand Christian history, you have to start with the Christian values and then see how those Christian values worked out over time.
Yeah, that's a great segue, because we need to probably wrap up a little bit, Matt. Now, and I just want to make one comment before we hand back to you to close off this conversation, because I think this is great. It's really drawn us right back to the story. What story are you going to be reading into, what, your interpretation, as you say, of history? But one of the things we've talked a lot about, Christianity and, I guess, the rights of the individual, that every individual, but I think we've also got to accept that there are responsibilities of every individual as well. And I even see in our churches today, particularly in the Western world, there's a danger of us thinking that there's the paid professionals, for want of a better word, who do all the work, and we just come along. And again, if we want to be able to enjoy the wonderful community that is the church, we also need to step into our responsibilities as individuals as well. That's a slight tangent, but I think
it's not, because it's actually this is an interesting difference, and I think this is a good note to finish on, actually, because it's not just ideas that change the world; it's embodied ideas. It's interesting because, for all of their deficiencies, the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle and these guys, and the Stoics, Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and so forth, they had some good ideas, right? And there are some positive moral codes, I mean, Plato talked about goodness and ultimate, justice, and, Aristotle, did have some worthy ethical kind of principles, and so did the Stoics. And the problem was, no one ever really embodied these systems. They were just ideas. Stoicism, which is sort of the combination of the Platonist and Aristotelian kind of views, it becomes an unrealizable thing. It sounded great, but it was never really embodied. The difference with Christianity was that its influence came because people actually lived it. They embodied the ideas. It was not just the ideas, it was the ideas embodied. That's what gave it the power, because it was incarnate in the people. It was like the example of St. Francis. It was because Francis took this idea and he applied it to his life and he lived it. And this guy that went from being somebody to a nobody, but a nobody who embodied the truth, he has this enormous influence. He changes the environment that he's in. And this is the opportunity, actually. Let's come back to the recognition, fundamentally Christian idea of the recognition, the fundamental importance of every individual and the responsibility of every individual, not just to think right thoughts. Because remember, we live in a society of opinions, everyone's opinions against everyone else, right? It's quite a pagan sort of idea. And when we as Christians join in all those arguments and fights and debates about my opinion against your opinions, we're no better than the pagans. We need to focus actually on embodying the simple fundamental truths of Jesus, because that is what is going to ultimately change things.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.